A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
We are looking at a fundamental shift in the regional security calculus this week. For years, the conversation around the Iranian nuclear program has been dominated by this idea of deterrence through the threat of a massive aerial bombardment, the classic bunker buster scenario. But today's prompt from Daniel pushes us into a much more granular and frankly terrifying territory. He is asking about the operational feasibility of a special forces raid to actually seize 60% enriched uranium.
It is a wild premise, but it is one that has gained a lot of traction following Prime Minister Netanyahu's press conference earlier this month. I am Corn, by the way, and I have been digging through the technical specifications of what a kinetic intervention of this scale would actually look like. Netanyahu is claiming that the Iranian ballistic missile umbrella and their enrichment infrastructure have been significantly degraded. Maybe 20 to 30% of their centrifuge operational capacity is offline. He is suggesting there is this narrow surgical window to not just stop the clock, but to physically take the material off the board.
The distinction between a strike and a seizure is massive. In a strike, you are looking for structural failure. You want to collapse the ceiling of a facility like Fordow or Natanz. But a seizure requires you to enter, secure, and then somehow extract a substance that is not exactly easy to handle. Daniel mentioned the 60% enriched material specifically because that is the threshold. It is the point where you have done the vast majority of the work required to reach 90% weapons grade status. If you have the 60% stuff, you are essentially days or weeks away from a breakout.
That is the technical reality. Most people do not realize that enriching from natural uranium to 5% takes about 75% of the total effort. Going from 5% to 60% takes another 20%. The final jump from 60 to 90 is a tiny fraction of the total work. So, 60% uranium hexafluoride is essentially the crown jewels of their program. But here is the problem. This stuff is not just sitting in gold bars in a vault. It exists mostly as uranium hexafluoride, or UF6, which is a chemical nightmare to transport.
I was looking into the storage protocols for UF6. At room temperature, it is a solid, but it turns into a gas at relatively low temperatures. It is highly corrosive, it reacts violently with water, and if it leaks, it creates hydrofluoric acid. You cannot just throw a few canisters in a backpack and fast rope out of there. This brings us to the core of Daniel's question. Is this a realistic military objective or just a high-level political bluff? When we talk about diminished capability, we usually mean fewer missiles in the silos or fewer radars on the coast. But does that actually translate to a softer shell around the enrichment halls?
That is the million-dollar question. If the shell is still 80 meters of solid rock, it does not matter if the air defense is down by 30%. You still have to get through the rock. And you have to do it without destroying the very thing you are trying to steal. If you use a GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, you are essentially turning the facility into a tomb. You are not seizing anything. You are just burying it under 1 million tons of granite. To seize it, you need a smash and grab that is more grab than smash.
Let us dive into the technical constraints of moving that material. To move any significant quantity of 60% enriched UF6, you are talking about heavy-duty, lead-lined transport cylinders. A standard 30B cylinder weighs over 2,000 kilograms when full. Even the smaller laboratory-scale containers are heavy and require specific environmental controls. If a Special Forces team is inside Fordow, 80 meters underground, they are not just fighting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They are fighting the laws of physics and chemistry.
And the clock. In a standard raid, like the one on the Bin Laden compound, the time on target was less than 40 minutes. To seize uranium, you were looking at hours, if not days. You have to locate the specific cylinders, verify the enrichment levels with portable spectrometers, secure them in transport housings, and then move them up through the elevator shafts or tunnels. All while the entire Iranian military is converging on your position.
This is where the Fordow problem becomes insurmountable for a small team. We did a deep dive on site hardening back in episode 1017 when we looked at the nuclear shell game. Fordow is carved into a mountain. You are looking at 80 to 90 meters of rock overhead. Netanyahu's claims of degraded capabilities might mean their air defenses are suppressed or their missile launchers are in disarray, but it does not move the mountain. The physical architecture of these sites is designed specifically to prevent the kind of smash and grab Daniel is asking about.
It really is a fortress. To get to the enrichment halls, you have to go through multiple blast doors and narrow tunnels that are easily defended. If you want to seize the material, you have to keep the facility intact. You cannot just drop a heavy munition on the roof. The moment you use heavy explosives to breach the site, you risk a radiological release or a structural collapse that buries the material, so the operation would have to be almost entirely internal. It would be a high-stakes infantry engagement in a confined, radioactive environment.
I am curious about the blind corridor concept you mentioned earlier. If Netanyahu is right and their localized air defenses are failing, how does that change the extraction? In 26, with the advancements in cognitive electronic warfare, you could theoretically blind the sensors around Natanz for a few hours. That gives you a window to fly in heavy-lift rotary assets like V-22 Ospreys or the newer heavy-lift platforms.
The idea of a blind corridor is essentially using cyber-sabotage to create a temporary hole in their radar coverage. We saw a version of this during Operation Orchard in 2007 when Israel hit the Syrian reactor. They basically took over the Syrian radar screens and showed them a clear sky while the jets were flying right through. But an Osprey sitting on the ground at a nuclear site is a giant target. Even if the long-range S-400 batteries are blinded, every guy with a shoulder-fired missile in the vicinity is going to be heading toward that site.
And let us talk about the centrifuges themselves. These are IR-6 and IR-8 machines spinning at supersonic speeds. They are incredibly delicate. If you have a firefight in a centrifuge hall and a stray bullet hits a casing, that machine is going to disintegrate. If a cascade crashes, you have a massive release of UF6 gas into the room. Now your Special Forces team is operating in a cloud of hydrofluoric acid and radioactive gas. Their suits might hold for a while, but their visibility goes to zero, and their equipment starts to corrode.
It is a nightmare scenario, and it highlights why seizing material is exponentially harder than destroying it. In 1981, during Operation Opera, the Israelis destroyed the Osirak reactor before it was fueled. They did not have to worry about radiological fallout or seizing material. They just had to put bombs on a target. But in 26, the material already exists. It is already enriched. The mission has shifted from prevention to recovery, and the military doctrine has not caught up with the physical reality of what that requires.
You mentioned the trade-off between a smash and grab and a prolonged occupation. If you cannot get the material out in 30 minutes, you have to hold the site. That means you are not sending in a team of 20 SEALs or Sayeret Matkal commandos. You are sending in a brigade. You are talking about a full-scale tactical occupation of a sovereign nation's most sensitive military site. You need a security perimeter that can hold off armored divisions while your technicians work underground.
And that brings us to the second-order effects. If you occupy a nuclear site, you have crossed every red line in the book. The retaliation threshold for Iran would be hit instantly. Even if their ballistic missile capability is degraded by 30%, as Netanyahu claims, they still have hundreds of missiles left. They have proxies across the region. The moment those boots hit the ground at Fordow, you are looking at a total regional war.
This is the intelligence paradox. If Netanyahu is claiming that Iran's capabilities are diminished, he is essentially signaling that the risk-to-reward ratio has shifted. But as you said, diminished capability in terms of missile counts does not necessarily mean diminished security at the enrichment sites. In fact, if the Iranians feel their external deterrent is failing, they would likely consolidate their best troops and most advanced point defense systems around the nuclear core. If you lose your shield, you hold your sword a lot tighter.
We saw this in the 2018 nuclear archive theft. That was a brilliant intelligence operation where Mossad agents broke into a warehouse in Tehran and made off with half a ton of documents. But there is a massive difference between stealing paper and stealing fissile material. Paper does not require lead shielding. Paper does not turn into hydrofluoric acid if you drop it. And paper was kept in a relatively low-security commercial warehouse, not 80 meters under a mountain. The archive theft was a proof of concept for intelligence gathering, but it is a poor model for physical material seizure.
There is also the question of what happens if the operation fails midway. Imagine a scenario where a team is halfway through the extraction. They have the canisters in an Osprey, and the aircraft is downed. Now you have 60% enriched uranium sitting in a crash site in the middle of the Iranian desert. You have effectively created a dirty bomb scenario and handed the Iranians a justification for immediate, total escalation. The political risk is almost as heavy as the uranium itself.
It is the ultimate high-stakes gamble. If you succeed, you have the physical proof of their program, and you have reset their breakout clock by years. If you fail, you have probably started World War III. From a conservative strategic perspective, you have to ask if the degradation Netanyahu is talking about is enough to mitigate that risk. He mentioned that the breakout period has been capped because of the damage to the centrifuge hulls, but 60% enrichment is still the red line we discussed in episode 823.
I remember that discussion. The final percent is where the danger lies. Once you hit 60, the technical hurdles are mostly gone. It becomes a matter of political will. I wonder if this talk of a special forces raid is actually a form of psychological warfare. If you convince the Iranian leadership that their impenetrable facilities are actually vulnerable to physical seizure, you force them to change their behavior. You might force them to move the material, and the moment they move it, it becomes vulnerable to a conventional airstrike.
That is a classic move. It is the nuclear shell game we talked about in episode 1017. If they think Fordow is no longer safe, they might try to truck the material to a different site. A convoy of heavy trucks moving through the desert is a much easier target for a drone or strike package than a facility buried under a mountain. So, maybe the feasibility of the raid is less important than the perception of the raid's feasibility.
But Daniel's prompt asks us to look at the operational reality. If we assume for a moment that the order is given, what does the degraded capability Netanyahu mentioned look like on the ground? Does it mean the Iranians are running out of spare parts for their centrifuges? Does it mean their command and control is fractured?
It likely means a combination of both. We have seen reports of significant supply chain disruptions. The IR-6 centrifuges are incredibly complex machines. They require high-strength carbon fiber, specialized merging steel, and very specific high-frequency inverters. If the sanctions and the sabotage have slowed down the replacement of these parts, the Iranians might be running their remaining centrifuges at lower speeds to avoid crashes. That reduces the volume of material they can produce.
So if the production volume is down, the prize at the site might be smaller than we think. If they only have a few dozen kilograms of 60% material, does that change the math for a special forces team?
It makes the logistics slightly easier, but the tactical danger remains the same. Whether you are stealing 5 kilograms or 50, you still have to get through the same blast doors and fight the same guards. And here is a technical detail that often gets missed. Uranium hexafluoride is typically stored in large tanks, but for the actual enrichment process, it is fed through miles of piping. You cannot just seize the gas that is currently inside the centrifuges. You have to find the storage cylinders where the finished product is being collected. If the Iranians are smart, they are distributing that material into many small containers rather than a few large ones, specifically to make a seizure more difficult.
It is the old, don't put all your eggs in one basket strategy. If you have to find and secure 20 different small canisters hidden throughout a massive underground complex, your time on target goes from hours to days. And no special forces team is surviving for days inside a facility like Fordow.
I mean, looking at the tactical reality, you are essentially describing a suicide mission. Even with the best Tier 1 operators in the world, the environment is just too hostile. You have to consider the radiological aspect too. While 60% uranium is not as radioactive as spent fuel from a reactor, it still emits alpha particles and gamma radiation. In a confined space, if there is any damage to the containers, the team is going to be breathing in alpha emitters. That is a death sentence, even if they make it out of the facility.
So, the Netanyahu window might be more about the ballistic missile threat. If Israel or the United States believes they can now suppress Iran's ability to retaliate with long-range missiles, it makes a conventional strike more palatable. But a special forces raid to seize material still feels like something out of a Hollywood script rather than a viable military doctrine.
It feels that way because it is. When we look at the history of these types of operations, like the raid on the Entebbe airport or the Bin Laden raid, the objective was always a person or a small group of people. People can walk. People can be put on a helicopter in seconds. Fissile material is a heavy, toxic, radioactive industrial product. It is more like trying to rob a chemical plant while it is being defended by a division of elite troops.
What about the role of autonomous systems? In 26, we are seeing a lot more use of tactical robotics. Could you send in a swarm of small, autonomous ground vehicles to navigate the tunnels and find the material?
You could, and that might be the only way to do it. If you can flood the tunnels with thousands of small drones that can map the facility and identify the storage locations, you reduce the risk to human operators. But you still have the extraction problem. A drone cannot carry a 200-pound lead-lined cylinder out of a mountain. You still need the heavy lift capacity at the end of the day.
So if we are parsing Netanyahu's claims, we should probably look at them through the lens of deterrence by capability degradation, rather than preparation for seizure. He is telling the world that the Iranian program is weaker than it looks, which is intended to embolden the international community to take a harder line. But Daniel's question about seizing the material highlights the ultimate frustration of the nuclear age. Once the material exists, you cannot just make it disappear. You either blow it up and deal with the fallout, or you leave it where it is and try to negotiate.
There is a third option, which is the internal collapse scenario. If the degradation Netanyahu is talking about extends to the political stability of the regime, you might see a situation where the security at these sites becomes compromised from the inside. We have seen reports of high-level defections and industrial accidents that look a lot like internal sabotage. If you have an insider who can help you bypass the security and prepare the material for transport, the feasibility of a raid goes up exponentially.
That is a massive if. Betting an entire Special Forces unit and the risk of global war on the hope of an insider's help is a level of risk that most military commanders would find unacceptable. But it does point to the fact that the most successful seizures of nuclear material in history have been through intelligence and subversion, not through kinetic force.
That is the lesson of the 2018 archive theft. The most effective way to seize a nuclear program is to steal its brains, not its brawn. If you have the data, the designs, and the personnel records, you can dismantle the program from the outside by targeting the supply chain and the experts. But Daniel is right to be focused on the 60% material, because that is the physical reality that cannot be ignored. You can have all the data in the world, but if the other side has 50 kilograms of 60% UF6, they have a weapon.
Let us look at the second-order effects for a moment. Suppose a raid is attempted and it is partially successful. They get some of the material, but not all of it. What does the day after look like?
It is chaos. Even a partial seizure would be seen as a massive humiliation for the Iranian regime. They would be forced to respond aggressively just to maintain their domestic grip on power. You would likely see a total shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, cyber attacks on global financial systems, and a surge in proxy attacks across the region. And the worst part is, the Iranians would still have the remaining material and the knowledge to produce more. You would have triggered a total war without actually solving the underlying problem.
This brings us back to the distinction between tactical success and strategic failure. You could have a brilliant tactical operation where special forces perform flawlessly, they get in, they take the material, and they get out. But if the strategic result is a regional conflagration that leaves the world in a worse position, was it actually a success?
That is the question that haunts the halls of the Pentagon and the Kiryat in Tel Aviv. In a conservative worldview, you have to be clear-eyed about the limits of military power. Special forces are a scalpel, but a nuclear program is a systemic, nationwide infrastructure. You cannot cut out a system with a scalpel. You can only disable parts of it.
Netanyahu's March 26th claims are fascinating because they suggest the system is already failing. If the ballistic missile defense is degraded and the centrifuges are crashing, the Iranians are in a very vulnerable position. But that vulnerability might actually make them more dangerous, not less. It is the wounded animal theory of geopolitics.
It really is. If they feel their conventional deterrent is gone, the nuclear option becomes their only survival mechanism. That is why the 60% enrichment is such a critical red line. It is the point of no return. Once they cross that line into weapons grade, the logic of seizure becomes even more desperate and even more dangerous.
I want to touch on the material seizure versus facility destruction dichotomy one more time. Daniel's prompt is so interesting because it challenges the standard military response. If you destroy a facility, you are essentially burying the problem. You are saying, we can't have this material, so nobody can. But seizing it is an act of reclamation. It is saying, this material is so dangerous that we must possess it to keep the world safe.
It is a very different moral and strategic stance. Destruction is an act of denial. Seizure is an act of control. But the technical requirements for control are just so much higher. When you destroy a site like Natanz, you are using physics to solve a political problem. You are releasing a massive amount of kinetic energy to disrupt a mechanical process. When you seize material, you are trying to use human agency to overcome physics. You are trying to move a volatile radioactive substance through a hostile environment without letting the laws of chemistry kill you.
So, to answer Daniel's question directly, is it feasible? From everything we have looked at, the answer seems to be a very qualified no, unless you have perfect intelligence, total air superiority, and a level of internal cooperation from the Iranians that we have not seen yet. Netanyahu's claims of diminished capability might make a conventional strike more likely, but they do not make a special forces seizure any less of a logistical and tactical nightmare.
I would agree with that. The feasibility is almost zero for a standard special forces raid. It only becomes feasible if you redefine what a raid is. If you are talking about a weeks-long occupation of the site by thousands of troops, then yes, you could eventually extract the material. But that is not a raid, that is an invasion, and an invasion of Iran is a completely different conversation.
It is important for our listeners to keep an eye on the breakout time metrics in the coming months. If Netanyahu is right and the capability is degraded, we should see that breakout times start to stretch out. If it stays at the current 7-day sprint we discussed in episode 722, then his claims might be more political than technical.
That is the real indicator. The physics of enrichment do not lie. If they have the centrifuges and the feedstock, they can hit 90% in the matter of days. If that window starts to open up, then we know the sabotage and the degradation are working. But until that happens, the 60% material remains the most dangerous substance on the planet.
It really is. And the idea that we can just go in and take it is a comforting thought, but the reality is much more complex. It requires a level of precision and luck that rarely exists in the real world. We have to be careful not to fall into the trap of thinking that because our technology is better, the physical constraints of the world no longer apply.
That is the trap of the modern age. We think our cyber tools and our stealth drones can overcome everything. But at the end of the day, you still have to move a 2,000 kilogram cylinder of toxic gas out of a mountain. And there is no app for that.
No, there really isn't. I think the key takeaway here is the difference between intelligence-driven operations and material-driven operations. We are very good at the former. We are still very limited by the latter. If you want to understand why the Iran situation is so intractable, you just have to look at the weight of a lead-lined cylinder and the depth of the rock at Fordow.
It is a sobering reality. But it is one that we have to confront if we are going to have an honest conversation about national security in 26. We can't just rely on headlines and press conferences. We have to look at the chemistry and the logistics.
Well, Daniel, you certainly gave us a lot to chew on with this one. It is a terrifying topic, but a necessary one to explore. I think we have covered the major tactical and strategic hurdles, but as always, the situation on the ground is changing fast.
It really is. We'll be watching those breakout metrics very closely. If you want to dive deeper into the technical side of this, I highly recommend going back and listening to episode 823 on the final percent of enrichment. It gives you a really good sense of why that 60% mark is so critical.
And if you are interested in how we verify these things, episode 1017 on the nuclear shell game is essential. It covers the difficulty of knowing what is actually inside these facilities, which is the first hurdle for any raid.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the wheels on this show. We couldn't do this without his tireless work behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation pipeline for this show. They make the technical heavy lifting look easy.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives valuable, the best way to support us is to leave a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all our subscription links. We are on Telegram as well if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops.
Thanks for listening. We will be back soon with another prompt.
Stay curious. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow